We are now up to Mark chapter 7.
Okay.
And Jillian discussed brought us up to that point last week. And Mark 7 has, I was wondering if Jillian would get to this. Historically, this has been an important passage for the Worldwide Church of God, GCI, and our doctrinal changes, particularly in the discussion of clean and unclean foods. So that this was important. And Jillian doesn't have all that background, which means that she can approach it from a fresh perspective as well.
Okay.
What's about? But we'll take a look at it and see what Jesus said, and then too what Mark says.
Okay.
That's in there too. This will be a little refresher for some of us. That this has been a long time since,
yes,
1995, since those doctrinal changes were made. So that's quite a while ago. So let's take a look at the episode in Mark chapter 7. This NIV is given at the subhead title, "That Which Defiles."
okay.
Defile is not it's a religious category. It's not a matter of being clean as in terms of hygiene or germs, but it's a religious category. The word kind of could mean common or ordinary, and the Pharisees especially didn't want to be ordinary. They wanted to be different than ordinary. Because that's what they thought they should be. So we'll get into that too. Verse 1, the Pharisees and some of the teachers of the law who had come from Jerusalem, they had gone to Capernaum to check out this new teacher. They gathered around Jesus and saw some of his disciples eating foods with hands that were defiled, that is, unwashed. They weren't actually defiled, but they were defiled from the perspective of these Pharisees.
Yes.
Sometimes scripture is written in a way that presents a different perspective, and so we have to understand that, and we'll see that as we go on too. So they were eating with, they hadn't washed their hands in the customary way. And Mark explains this for his readers. He's writing to Gentiles. The Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they give their hands a ceremonial washing, holding to the tradition of the elders. Part of their rationale in this was that they wanted to have the level of purity in their daily life, the level of purity that priests were required to have in the temple. They were kind of figuring, I guess, that if God wanted that for the priests in the temple, that means it's better, and therefore everybody ought to do it.
Mm-hmm.
Well, they were adding to what God had required. And so Jesus calls them in on that too. Verse 4, when they come from the marketplace, and who knows, they know that people in the marketplace didn't necessarily observe all the cleanness rituals. So just going to the marketplace, they might have accidentally touched somebody who was unclean. So just in case, they always wash their hands afterwards. They do not eat unless they wash. And they had a precise procedure on how they washed and how much water they had to use. They had added, the tradition developed as it went on. And they observed many other things, many other traditions, Mark says, such as the washing of cups and pitchers and kettles. Well, some of those the Old Testament did describe. You should have it wash this cup if a lizard falls into it, for example. If a lizard didn't fall into it, you don't have to wash it. You don't have to do any ceremonial rituals for it. But they had kind of added regulations just to be sure, just be sure. They talked about making a fence around the law. They don't even want you to get close to the edge so that you broke it. They wanted everything to be very carefully controlled.
But they didn't have to wear masks.
Yeah, no, the lepers did. But they didn't know anything about aerosols and the spread of viruses through that way, though. So they had these traditions, and Mark is explaining them. Some Gentiles were aware of that. Some Gentile writers would talk about how Jews did all these ritual washings and things, but not all of them knew, so Mark is explaining it. Verse 5, so the Pharisees and the teachers of the law asked Jesus, why don't your disciples do this? Why don't they live according to the tradition of the elders instead of eating their food with defiled hands? Well, Jesus didn't answer them right away. He went into kind of something else. Verse 6, Isaiah was right when he prophesied about you hypocrites. That was not a very nice way to start the discussion, but he was pointing out that what they were doing was hypocritical. Now, because of the Gospels, this word hypocrite has a very negative slant on it. This is the only place that Mark uses it. Matthew uses it numerous times, so we almost we equate Pharisees with hypocrites. But when Mark first used the word here, it kind of meant a play actor. They were pretenders, and the nuance of that word developed as Matthew uses it so frequently for the Pharisees. But he's saying, so Mark is saying Isaiah was right. He's calling them play actors. They are pretending to do something when actually they're not. And that's, close to our understanding of what hypocrisy is. They say one thing, do another. But then he goes back to, quotes this thing from Isaiah 29, and he quotes part of it. And the part that he quotes is quite close to what Isaiah had written. These people honor me with their lips. They say they worship me, but their hearts, he says, they're not really doing what I say. They worship me in vain. Their teachings are merely human rules. So they have created this. So, and Jesus is saying, these are human rules. These are, you should not be judging other people based on your human rules. And if you want to have an extra washing before you eat dinner, that's fine. But don't criticize other people for not doing it, because it's not required. There's no religious requirement for that. But whereas they were saying it was. Verse 8, you have let go of the commands of God, abandoned them, and holding on to human traditions. And then he will go ahead and give an example of that. Verse 9 is kind of a repeat. You have a fine way. It's kind of he's starting with a good word. It's good. You have a good way of setting aside the commands of God. It's kind of an ironic way to start. A good way of doing something bad. Setting aside the commands of God in order to observe, or actually observe is probably a little soft there. What they were doing is not just observing, but also forcing it on other people. For Moses, verse 10, Moses said, here Jesus is giving the example of where they have set aside the commands of God. Moses said, honor your father and mother. That's in the 10 Commandments. Exodus 20, I give the verse 12. It's also in Deuteronomy 5. But Exodus 20 also says, and gives elaboration, anyone who curses their father or mother is to be put to death. This is a serious command. Verse 11, but they were saying that if anyone declares that what might have been used to help their father or mother is korban, which is the Hebrew word meaning devoted to God, then you no longer let them do anything for their father and mother. So here we have to untangle what is this korban business. And in some ways, we are not sure why people did this. They may have had different motives in doing it, but what they would take their property, their house, all their possessions, and say, all this is dedicated to God when I die. And therefore, then they would say, therefore, I cannot use it to to support my mother and father. Although I can still use it for myself. So that was kind of a dirty trick that they were doing. And the Pharisees would say, well, the vow that you took, dedicating this to God, can't be broken. So therefore, you are not able to help your father and mother with it. So Jesus is criticizing them for saying that the vow is more important. Their vow is more important than the command of God. That they hadn't weighted these different obligations correctly. One's more important than the other. It would be better for them to break their vow and to keep the command than to the other way around. He doesn't get into that detail, I guess. But part of it is why would a person do such a thing? Was it trying to get bragging rights and say, oh, I've dedicated all my stuff to God? Or was it a moment of anger against their parents, father and mother, and they say, well, I'll get back at you. You're not going to share in what I have. It's not sure. We're not sure exactly why that happened, but apparently it did. And the Jewish Talmud does describe that people did that. Mark is not making this up. So they had this misguided sense of what was important. They were holding their tradition more important than the command of God that these people ought to be supporting their father and mother. And so he summarizes verse 13, you nullify the word of God by your tradition that you've handed down. And you do many things like that. So his point here is, they were saying, well, why aren't you keeping the traditions? And he's saying, well, your traditions are it's not just unnecessary, but they are actually getting in people's way. When people erect these traditions and they elevate them, they start competing with pushing aside the commands of God. And wrongly so. Not all tradition is wrong, but in this case, it was, and we cannot hold a tradition more important to us than, or even say that it's equal importance to the commands of God. And so Jesus doesn't really directly say that there's anything wrong with their tradition about washing. He's not saying, well, you shouldn't wash, but he's kind of in the setting, we see that he is saying you shouldn't be judging others based on this because God hasn't commanded it. Any comments, questions so far? This obscure Jewish custom. But then verse 14, Jesus expands this. He also expands the audience here. He calls the crowd to him. And then he says, listen to me, everybody, understand this. Nothing outside a person can defile them by going into them. Rather, it's what comes out of a person that defiles them. So he's saying, you're not defiled by stuff you touch. You're defiled by what you do, by what you're thinking, what you're saying. Those are the things that are defiling. That's the religious things that really count. And some manuscripts, like if you're looking at a King James Bible, you'll see there that it has, if anyone has ears to hear, let them hear. Most of the better Greek manuscripts don't have that here, but some of them, the ones that the King James Version were based on, do have that. It's just a repeat from Mark 4:23. Some scribe apparently thought that this was a very important saying, so he put a note in the margin, and it got copied into the text the next time around. Doesn't add any, doesn't change the teaching any. Then after he had left the crowd and entered the house, his disciples asked him about the parable. I wondered, well, if the disciples didn't understand, what did the crowd do? What did they understand of this parable? They smarter than the disciples? Well, Mark doesn't tell us. It's interesting. Earlier we saw how Jesus spoke to the crowd in parables. And he said so that they wouldn't understand. But yet clearly the crowds like to hear him teach. They were listening, and they must have understood something. So here, anyway, Jesus explains a little bit more about what he says here. He's explaining it to the disciples. Are you so dull? He says, are you slow to understand? Don't you see that nothing that enters a person from the outside can defile them? It doesn't go into their heart, but into their stomach, then out of the body. So he's focusing on the heart as the focal area for religious cleanness. That's where we need to be clean in the heart. Being clean on the surface may be good, but that's not religiously, that's not affecting our relationship with God. And then in here, the NIV adds this in parentheses, indicating that it is Mark's words rather than the words of Jesus. Mark is explaining the significance of what Jesus has said. And saying this, Jesus declared all foods clean. Well, that's like a bombshell for a Jewish reader.
Yes.
Wow, how could he do such a thing? Wasn't that one of the commands of God? So, it's like, is he replacing one human tradition with another? There, we have to kind of back up and say, well, who is it that's saying this? Does Jesus have the authority to say this? And there we have to say, well, yes, he does. He's the Son of God. He is God's representative. He lived without sin, so his teachings are without sin. He apparently had the authority to do that. And similarly, he had authority to change rules about the Sabbath. We see in the early church that various rule like circumcision was set aside. Rules about eating with Gentiles, they were set aside. Some of those were Pharisee rules, others were biblical rules. But in all those cases, we see that biblical laws were set aside. We don't wear phylacteries. We do not wear tassels on our garments. Some of those things that the old covenant did include. So we see there are some changes from before Jesus and after Jesus. And this apparently is one of them. Mark, although the disciples probably didn't figure this out at the time, this was an understanding that came to them after the resurrection. It took them even 10 years to realize that Gentiles could come into the church without being circumcised. And so they were probably still keeping all these rules about food laws and other things for at least those 10 years and probably a lot longer as well. It's not easy to change a tradition that is so deeply embedded in a culture. but Mark is, giving it the clear statement that Jesus declared all foods clean. That doesn't mean that it's necessarily a smart thing to eat that all foods. Some foods aren't very good for you, but at least they do not make us religiously unclean. There are not religious rules about that affect our relationship with God.
Yes.
Mike, I have a question.
Sure.
Are you familiar with the history of how these man-made traditions came about between Malachi and Matthew? Within the intertestamental period, 400 years. I want to be more familiar with that, but I've just always been curious, what happened in those 400 years? How did all this come about? Because Israel used to be, wayward, they were always the complete opposite of what God wanted. And how did they go from that to like the other side of the spectrum of just being, and I'm so obsessed with rules and traditions that they claim to be godly or God's more. I don't know.
Yeah, well, I'll give you a 100-page book that describes the history involved in that.
Let's give a Cliff Notes version.
Yeah, but as you note the contrast there, that as the Old Testament closes, the Jews are sent into exile, and for being so disobedient, for abandoning the God of their fathers. But then it also includes the books of Ezra, Nehemiah, and Malachi that describe some of them coming back to the land of Judea and rebuilding the walls, rebuilding the city, a new temple, kind of a repentance for those people. That Cyrus allowed them to return and to regather, to become a nation again. And there, through Ezra, was a kind of a primary teacher at one point who taught them the law. But those people were saying, all our idolatry, our deviations from God's law, got us sent into slavery, into exile. Therefore, we need to be very careful about what we do and how we live. We don't want it to happen again. And in a way, they were still in exile, even though when they were in Judea, they were still ruled by Gentile powers. But so they tried to be very careful. They developed, this is in the time period in which synagogues developed. People did not have the temple to go to, but they came together to study the law. The law became the replacement of the temple in a way. So that was what gave them ethnic cohesion. Identity distinct as a people was the law. So they studied that. That was part of their worship, was to study the law. As things went forward, there were different parties, different groups developed among the Jews. This is when Sadducees, Pharisees, Essenes, they became distinct groups in opposition to one thing or another, usually opposition to each other in some way or another. But it was generally because Essenes and Pharisees had many things in common, but other things they were different on. And the reason they were different on them, and they called each other children of the devil, because they were so focused on, they wanted so badly to do what was right. So they tried to get every detail written down, say, yes, we have to do this, we have to do that. And so this body of tradition developed. What the Pharisees were apparently the larger party that had more favor with the people, even though not all the people were official members of the party. they at least looked up to them, the Pharisees, as the ones who were being faithful. That they kind of defined faithfulness for everybody else. The Essenes were much radical in going off to their monasteries in the desert, or some Essenes lived in cities, but they were also very reclusive, even in the cities. So that's kind of a short version of how those things.
Very good.
Yeah, thank you.
Can I comment, Mike, on the aspect of washing hands has become a tradition among the Jews. We understand, of course, that this is mainly religious or ceremonial, but somehow you kind of wonder, that God used the washing of hands, this hygienic stuff, that God knows about germs and bacteria and so forth, and has, in traditional history, has benefited the Jews. Like, for example, in Europe, when there was this bubonic plague, somehow the Jewish community was safer because of their practices, while they didn't know anything about bacteria. I mean, it's only recently. In fact, I was reading a while ago that it's only 130 years and that doctors began to wash hands while they're doing surgery, But in the Bible, we already see way, way before, 1,000 year plus BC, the Jews were already washing their hands, and they didn't realize that it has benefit for hygiene, Anyway, that's just something that you cannot avoid think about it, although they didn't know about hygiene much, but it did help them.
Yeah, I did. It's for, yeah, God gave them, or at least he gave the Levites instructions. He didn't command the same kind of washings for everybody else, but at least the commands he gave for the Levites, they were handling fresh meat. They were the butchers of the day. Not all of the sacrifices were gone up in smoke. People also ate them. So yeah, the custom of washing hands could have helped in the way they handled the meat. Yeah, it's kind of it's people did not understand about germs, but it didn't. That kind of practice did turn out to help them.
Yeah, this passage, that which defiles, always I always remembered of this story. I mean, back in 1995 when we changed, from old to new, and my dad was a pastor then, and after church they had members would come and ask about the tithe, what happened to the tithe, what happened to Sabbath, and all the feasts, and it's hard, and now I understand it's hard to really, because you have been used to doing these traditions and changing it overnight or telling them, it takes a process to to get over it, and many people were confused, offended, and even hurt, and and my poor dad was trying to encourage them and be patient, and then I was 20 plus, and then of course, because it takes long, they order food, and then guess what? Food comes with shrimps and everything, crustaceans, and nobody complains. And I said, oh boy, look at this. Everybody complains about other laws, but the issue of food is not an issue in the Philippines. I mean, they eat. Oh, I said, what happened? I said, and I was with myself just laughing, and I see them, meeting and all of this upset and everything. And I said, just look at the food you're eating. You're already eating shrimp and other stuff, and you don't complain. What Oh, well, I said, I give up. I said, so let's see.
Different people have different sensitivities.
Yeah. But the funny thing is, many people had issue with pork. They won't eat pork. But with shrimp or others, that's fine. But I don't know why. But they say it's because it's gonna give you high blood or something. But Anyway, yeah.
All right.
Yeah, as the youngest person in this group, I believe, because Mike mentioned, how interesting my viewpoint would be. I think what Jesus says in this passage really makes sense. I kind of like in verse 18, it says in the NIV, "Are you so dull?" And I don't want to say that to people, but and it's just like it's kind of like a duh for me. Like it really makes sense. Like his logic makes so much sense. What comes out of a person is what defiles them. It's from our heart, it's from within, and it's nothing necessarily that we touch. Of course, there are things that we touch that, obviously with bacteria, but I don't know how aware they were of that at that time. But I think what Jesus is really getting at is just how deeply embedded sin and evil is in all of creation, but specifically humanity, and how desperately we need a savior. Yeah, he really gets to the heart of it, literally.
Yeah, they thought that the thoughts came from the heart. Aristotle thought that the brain was a cooling mechanism for the heart.
Oh wow.
Like they did not know what the brain was for. When the Egyptians mummified a person, they would carefully preserve the heart, but they would suck out the brains and throw them away. It's like, this is a useless organ. But yeah, their understanding of biology was not perfect.
It had to do with the ritualistic behavior being replaced by Jesus Christ and his sacrifice and what he did. He took it to the next level, the heart.
Yeah, the heart. We could also use, say in the mind. It's the same, like a similar figure of speech that in our
Yes.
that's what really makes the difference in who we are is how we're thinking.
Yes.
Yes, in matter of fact, Lee is correct because I've noticed before, even in myself when I was a young convert, that I was holding to the laws, the Ten Commandments, the Sabbath, all the laws. They were like the pillars of my conversion. They were the things that told me what is right and wrong. But then I had to replace it with Jesus and his relations, and that change, boy, that change takes time.
Yes.
You have to let go of one and to accept one. Now,
Yes.
the main difference was, I don't know about for others, but for me is that because it's written law, it's clear, it's black and white, you know what to do. But with Jesus' relationship, if you're starting, you don't know how to start the relationship. It's hard to trust someone you don't know yet. But because the law is black and white, it tells you what to do. And it's easy for me to, just to have a relationship with this law, but with Jesus, if you don't had it's hard to start, and I had to start all over again, and that's what's painful sometimes. Let going of the other and accepting who is this Jesus. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
I think, as I said, I think relationship with Jesus seems hard because it's very simple. Because the way we measure it is we kind of measure it with the black and white. And then with Jesus, it's the simplicity of Jesus, it's the faith. It's so simple, but then it boggles the mind. That's why we think, this is so hard. You know what I mean? It doesn't have to be complicated. It says give me all your burden, and Christ is light and easy, there's no yoke as to carry. His yoke is light and easy. But you're right, so people struggle. I know that because, in ministry, dealing with people, they said, is this it? They're looking for something more. They're looking for lists and regulations. And they cannot just grapple the fact that, yeah, it is all about our identity in Jesus.
Yes.
That's simple. Grace, that's simple. But we want to complicate it. So we struggle. As I did,
Because it's spiritual.
Yeah.
All right, let's look finish up this episode there in this pericope, as they call it. Verse 20, Jesus kind of summarizes or elaborates too. He says, he went on, what comes out of a person is what defiles them. Right? It actually shows that they're defiled. It's, the defiling starts even before it comes out. But when it's in there, then it shows that they are defiled. It is from within, out of a person's heart, that evil thoughts come. So he mentions quite a few: sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, greed, malice. Some of these are 10 commandments, others are not. Deceit, lewdness, envy, slander, arrogance, and folly. All these evils come from inside and defile a person. That's kind of a little sin list from Jesus. If you're looking for black and white, those are some things that we need to avoid. The next passage here kind of goes with this. After Jesus says that meats our foods are not a matter of being clean or unclean, then he also has this going into Gentile territory. This is not the first time he's gone into Gentile territory. He went for the, he casting a demon out of the man who lived in the tombs. That was in the Gentile area. But here he does it again, and it's developed a little bit more about Jesus' ministry to the Gentiles. So Jesus left that place, wherever that was, and went to the vicinity of Tyre. And here I want to switch to a different screen. Look at a little map. All right. I keep losing my mouse on this one. There we go. Capernaum is about there. So when Jesus went to Tyre, he would have gone north and then west. So he's outside of the region where Jews lived. Most of them did not live further north than Akko. And that's still, this is kind of like the southern boundary of Lebanon today. You don't go, straight there because it's a mountainous area. You can't go straight very easily in a mountain. So he would have gone through some passes to get to Tyre. That's where he's going later. The passage says that he goes further north to Sidon, and then he goes back to the Decapolis, which is east of the Sea of Galilee. So he is really taking a roundabout way of getting there. Somebody described it, it's like going from New York to Chicago by way of Minneapolis. It's just, he went further than necessary, but he was traveling. And Mark doesn't tell us what he did there, but just that he went through. It is interesting because near Sidon is about 8 miles south of Sidon, which is about there, say, is the town of Zarephath, where Elijah had an interaction with a Phoenician woman, a Canaanite woman. So in some ways, there are parallels between what Jesus does here and what Elijah had done a long time before in the same area. Let's go back to the text. So verse 24, Jesus left there, went to the vicinity of Tyre, not the city, but in the vicinity. He entered a house, not want anyone to know it. Hopefully the owner did. Yet he could not keep his presence secret. Mark is saying that Jesus' fame spreads just uncontrollably, even in a Gentile area, that his fame as a healer, as a teacher, went before him. So verse 25, as soon as she heard about him, a woman whose little daughter was possessed by an impure spirit came and fell at his feet. So she knew she had a need, and she knew that Jesus could take care of it. And Mark goes out of his way to tell us this is not just a Gentile area, but that this woman was a Gentile. The woman was a Greek, born in Syrian Phoenicia. Phoenicia, this area was administered as part of the province of Syria, the Roman province. So she begged Jesus to drive the demon out of her daughter, to cast him out. So I mentioned there the passage in 1 Kings 17, where Elijah has this interaction with the woman. At first, Elijah makes a very difficult request of this woman. He says, she says, I only have enough food for one meal. And he says, well, give it to me. A very shocking command. In some ways, there's a parallel with Jesus giving a shocking command statement to this woman. But Elijah, but then the flour and the oil never ran out. Later, the widow had she had a son, and the son died, and she said, what is this? But then Elijah raised the son from death. So this was this great miracle, and Jesus refers to this in his sermon at Nazareth. That's part of the thing that the people of Nazareth don't like, that he talks about ministering to non-Jewish people in comparison with Elijah. But here Jesus had purposely gone into a Gentile area as some kind of retreat with his disciples. But his retreat also turns into a little bit of work as well. So this woman begged Jesus to drive the demon out of her daughter. And Jesus gives her a kind of a shocking answer. Most commentators struggle with what to do with this statement. Jesus says, first, let the children eat all they want, for it is not right to take the children's bread and toss it to the dogs. So he's here, Jesus, being a very nice guy, seems to be calling her a very not nice name. So what's going on here? There are some different theories on what's going on here. One is that Jesus knew she had faith and wanted to challenge her to draw more out of her on that. Perhaps as a lesson for the disciples, that Jesus knew what he was going to do ahead of time, but he knew the disciples would be, this proverb that he has here could have been on the disciples' mind already. It's just, what you're doing, that's not right. Why are you ministering to, helping them out? They're not one of us. And this could have been a proverb. Some say that it's because the area of Galilee exported wheat to this region of Tyre. And that even, and so they had this contract, they had to ship so many thousand pounds of wheat to Tyre each year. But when the crop wasn't very good, they still had to send just as much because of their contract. So they were taking the children's bread, the wheat, and sending it over there to the Gentiles. So some think that this proverb might have been used for that kind of international trade agreement. There are a couple of things that kind of soften the comment here from Jesus. First, first word, first. Jesus, by using that word first, Jesus implies that there will come a time when it's appropriate for this bread to be given to others. And the other thing is to let the children eat all they want. And Jesus has already ministered in the areas of Galilee. And he, in some ways, he'd been rebuffed in certain areas. They didn't want what he had. So in some ways, the children had already eaten all they wanted. And when he refers to dogs, he doesn't, there's a couple of words for dogs. They're wild dogs, and there are another word that's used for kind of a diminutive little dog or puppy, but even then, it wasn't a very nice word to call somebody. And the words could be used interchangeably. But no matter what word Jesus used here, what he's saying could be offensive. He's saying, no, it's not right for me to help you out. And I'm supposed to help somebody else. But that didn't stop the woman. She knew she had a need, and she knew that Jesus could take care of it. So she persisted. She didn't let go of it. Lord, she said, even the dogs under the table. So here she's referring to a house pet, which Jews didn't have dogs as house pets. Dog was an unclean animal. They didn't want them in the house. They'd have them out in the fields to take care of rabbits, and that's, to keep the rabbit population down. But they didn't have them in the house, whereas Gentiles sometimes did. So this Gentile woman was able to say, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs, even before the children are finished, as part of the context then. So she's saying, oh yeah, it can still be appropriate. And all I'm asking from you is just a little crumb. You've got the power to do, heal thousands of people. I'm just asking for one. And it's not going to hurt the children any. So her response is kind of bold. In a way, she understood Jesus' parable when the disciples had failed to understand his parables. But here she understood a parable, and she was able to use it in a way to for her need. And Jesus was happy with that. He says, for verse 29, for such a reply, you may go. The demon has left your daughter. And she believed him. She went home. She found her child lying on the bed, the demon gone. So it's a great example of faith. We don't know what happened to the lady or the daughter later, but this is something, or even how the disciples found out what happened to the girl. But the point here is that Jesus does have, he's kind of setting the example for his disciples, and Mark is relaying this example for his disciples of ministry in Gentile areas. that even though, as Paul described it, to the Jew first and then to the Gentile, Jesus could also say, yeah, he came to Judea or he came to the Jews first, Galilee actually, rather than Judea. But it expands from there, and it's not contained by, you got to start somewhere. So God started with the Jews, but the reason he started there is so that he could expand from there. And this is what he's doing here with his Gentile woman. So she was able to kind of have this banter with him and win the argument. Jesus may well have known in advance that she would, that her faith was strong enough to that she would not let go of her request, but it was acted out so that we can see what was going on there, that Jesus made his decision to reach to the Gentiles, to let his blessings go there as well. This is just a temporary time in his ministry, but after his resurrection, of course, it will become a major thrust for what the disciples do. Comments from you?
Very rich, Mike. Thank you.
I find it interesting that this woman in verse 27, and I'm reading the New King James Version, when he tells her, see, I'm sorry, I had the wrong one. Let your children be filled first. I'm not following on the verse right now, but it says that she I think NIV says she begged Jesus, and the New King James says she kept asking him. And I think that persistence, and then the next verse, when he tells her, calls her a dog and everything, she comes back and she said, she refers to him as Lord. She says, yes, Lord. And so this woman did have an understanding that, as you mentioned, that perhaps others did not.
I think that, yeah, someone commentary said this is the only place in Mark where someone calls him Lord. So that's, yeah, I'm glad you pointed that out. Yeah, she was very respectful.
Yes.
I think too, it's a metaphor. I mean, from the Philippines, considered Gentile, even in the old WCG, but to me, it doesn't really offend me. However, I'm called in a metaphor. It's a metaphor. It's a figure of speech. Even when Peter had a dream, the Gentiles were considered unclean. Remember that thing that came from heaven, and God said, eat, and he was referring to Cornelius. That's unclean, right? But I don't find that offensive, because we are redeemed, from our uncleanness, from our animal kind of nature. We were sinful. It's okay. I mean, anyway, Christ has redeemed us. Christ has rescued us. That is what is important. I think, but sometimes people can be so sensitive and can be offended. Personally, I'm not offended. It's just a figure of speech. That's how I look at it.
And one commentator was saying, Jesus was right to do that, but we should not be doing this kind of thing. Well, and part of the big reason is that times have changed. Jesus has been resurrected. The gates have been opened, and then the work is no longer restricted to the Jews. It has gone to the Jews. They have had as much as they want to eat, and there is still a lot left over. So that's where we intend to go.
Just like to make side comment, because my kids, and probably the young generation today, when they watch movies today, and they call Japanese cartoons, animes, and everything, and cartoons and entertainment. When they deal with demons and zombies and everything, it's all about action. The- you will see the amount of effort that these supposed heroes to just cast out a demon or kill a demon almost like takes their life. But then when you look at Jesus, they said, okay, he's gone.
Yeah, this was
I mean, yeah,
casting out a demon from a distance.
yeah. And if I was a movie maker, I can't make that movie like interesting. It's less. there's no drama. There's no nothing, and it's just like, okay, you, because of you said it. So yeah, that's why it's funny, because when you look at this, they show the drama, and the heroes almost die because of their effort, but I don't know. Jesus just talks and they're gone.
Great point.
Looks like a
Edgar.
battle.
Great point.
Mhm. Yeah, Jesus, when he does exorcisms or healings, yeah, it's pretty simple. It's usually just a word. The next episode, which we'll don't have time for today, but we'll get to next week, Jesus does a few other things, and we'll talk about why he does those different actions in this case. But yeah, your point is right. Jesus just as he could create with a word, he can also heal with a word.
I think the reality is more painful, because the Bible does say that once we were yet in darkness, we were in the clutches of evil, we were slaves of sin. I mean, those are reality, and they are worse than being called metaphorically an unclean animal.
Right. Yeah, that's right. Okay, well, that brings us to 8 o'clock. So thanks everybody for your participation. We'll have a good week. We'll see you again.
Nah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, guys.